soldier unjustly imprisoned. 13 years later, the thing. His canine German Shepherd brought in his mouth changed everything. They said he was guilty. The court called it justice. But deep down, everyone knew something was off. 13 years ago, Staff Sergeant Nolan Briggs, a decorated American soldier, was taken away in handcuffs, accused of a crime he swore he didn't commit. His uniform stripped, his honor erased, his name buried under shame. But there was one soul who never doubted him, a loyal German Shepherd, K9, named Titan. Titan had been Nolan's partner during missions overseas. Together, they survived ambushes, landmines, and the worst mankind had to offer. But when Nolan was arrested, Titan tried to follow. He howled, bit through leashes, barked at the gates of the prison for days. Eventually, they were separated. Forever, or so everyone thought. Until one morning, 13 years later, Titan came back. Nobody knows how he survived all this time, how he kept searching, remembering. But what truly shocked the world wasn't just Sina the dog found his way back to Nolan. It was what Titan had clenched in his jaws. A single weathered item that would force the truth to surface after more than a decade of lies. What was it? And how could a dog do what the system never did? Prove a man's innocence. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. It helps us bring more true and inspiring stories like this one to you. This is a journey of loyalty, loss, and redemption you won't forget. Because sometimes, justice barks louder than words. 13 years earlier, the name Nolan Briggs meant something. Decorated staff sergeant, war hero. The kind of man who didn't flinch under fire, who carried wounded men across enemy lines, who once went 3 days without sleep during a rescue mission in Kandahar. His unit trusted him, his superiors respected him, and his K9 partner, Titan, a sharp-eared German Shepherd, trained to sniff out IEDs and protect Nolan at all costs, worshipped him like a god. But everything changed on a summer morning in 2012. The base was quiet. Too quiet. A supply truck had gone missing, and whispers were spreading about stolen military assets, sensitive, high-value equipment that could compromise national security. When investigators arrived, it took less than 48 hours for fingers to point toward Nolan. Someone had planted forged logs and falsified camera footage. It didn't matter that he had no motive, no history of misconduct, and had just returned from saving an entire unit from ambush. Someone wanted him gone. And it worked. They came for him in the middle of a training session. Titan barked and lunged at the guards. Nolan tried to calm him, but the chaos was too much. They tore the leash from his hand, dragged him away, and stuffed him into a vehicle without so much as a chance to say goodbye. That day, everything died for Nolan. His career, his reputation, his freedom. And somewhere behind the wire fences of that base, Titan waited. For days, then weeks. Eventually, they separated the Mo from the military program, declaring him emotionally unstable. But no one knew where he ended up. Rumors said he was adopted by a civilian. Others said he escaped during a transport and was never found. Back in the cold, gray walls of Middleton Correctional Facility, Nolan kept his head down. He didn't talk about the betrayal. He didn't speak to the press. His appeals were denied year after year. The only photo in his cell was of Titan, laminated and slightly torn at the edges. And every night, before sleeping on the narrow cot, he whispered the same words. If anyone remembers me, it's you. In the outside world, time marched on. War heroes were replaced. Stories forgotten. But in a small, wind-blown town in Colorado, something stirred. A stray German Shepherd had been seen lingering around a construction site on the edge of town. He was massive, with faded patches in his fur and eyes that looked through people instead of at them. He wouldn't come close to anyone, wouldn't take food unless it was placed far away. But he was always watching, waiting, searching. The locals called him Ghost. What no one knew was that Ghost was Titan, and he hadn't forgotten. Then, one morning, 13 years to the day of Nolan's arrest, Titan showed up at the gates of Middleton Prison. He wasn't barking. He wasn't aggressive. He was limping slightly, his coat caked with dust and dried blood. But what stopped the guards cold wasn't just his sudden appearance. It was the small object clutched gently in his mouth. A dog tag. One that belonged to a man long thought dead. A man connected to the original stolen supply case. The guards called it a coincidence. The warden wasn't so sure. And inside cell 3B, when the news reached Nolan's ears that a German shepherd had arrived at the prison gate with a tag bearing the name of the man who had testified against him, his knees gave out. The walls spun. The air felt heavy. "Titan?" he whispered, breathless. "Is it really you?" He hadn't spoken that name aloud in over a decade, but somehow, somewhere the bond they once shared had pulled Titan back across miles, years, and danger. And with him, perhaps, the truth. The warden's office was quiet when they brought Nolan in, still wearing his beige jumpsuit, eyes hollow from years of silence. He had no idea why he'd been summoned. Prisoners weren't called into this office unless something was terribly wrong or impossibly right. Warden Harper, a tall woman with steel gray hair and a cold but fair reputation, motioned for him to sit. "You had a visitor this morning," she said. Nolan blinked. "I don't get visitors." She studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the corner of the room. That's when he saw him. Titan. His heart stopped. The dog sat silently on a blanket near the window, his body still, his eyes locked on Nolan. He looked older, leaner, his once glossy coat now grizzled with white and dirt. But the moment their eyes met, the world fell away. "Titan?" Nolan whispered. The dog's ears twitched. Then he stood. One slow step, then another. Then a sudden, powerful sprint. Titan lunged toward Nolan, not to attack but to embrace. He whined deep in his chest, tail thrashing, pushing his head against Nolan's chest so hard it nearly knocked him off the chair. Nolan dropped to his knees. "I thought you were gone," he choked, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck. "I thought they took you from me." Titan licked his face, let out a single breathy bark, and nudged something with his nose. That's when Nolan noticed the object near the blanket. The dog tag, still smeared with dry blood. Still bearing the name, Lieutenant Mason Durrell. Nolan stared at it like a ghost. Durrell had been the prosecution's star witness. A fellow soldier who claimed to have seen Nolan make the trade, claimed he'd witnessed the crime. Durrell disappeared after the trial. No one ever found him again. No contact, no confirmation of his death, no body, until now. Titan had brought back proof that the man wasn't missing. He was dead. "How did he?" Nolan's voice broke as he looked to Harper. She sat back, stunned. "That dog showed up outside the south gate at dawn, wouldn't let anyone near him until one of the guards recognized the name on the tag and remembered your case." Nolan stood slowly, his hands trembling. "You think this means?" Harper shook her head. "I don't know yet, but this just reopened something that's been shut for over a decade." Word spread through the prison like wildfire. The inmate with the dog, the war hero who might have been framed, the K9 that came back after 13 years with a piece of the puzzle clenched in his mouth. That night, Nolan couldn't sleep. Titan lay on the floor beside his bunk, breathing slow and heavy, like he had finally reached the place he'd been running toward for years. Nolan stared at the ceiling, remembering missions, Darrell's face, the betrayal in that courtroom, and the moment the cuffs had closed around his wrists. But now, the silence was different. There was hope in it. The next morning, an investigation team arrived from the Department of Defense. They took the tag, started combing through old case files, and asked questions no one had dared to ask in years. Nolan was interviewed for the first time in over a decade. As he spoke, Titan stayed beside him the entire time. His body pressed close, ears alert, eyes on every face in the room. Investigators asked about Darrell, where he might have gone. Nolan remembered a cabin Darrell once mentioned during a mission briefing, somewhere near the Colorado border. A place he called his vanishing point. 3 days later, a search team found the remains of a man matching Darrell's description near that cabin. Next to him, a torn military satchel and a journal. The entries revealed everything: guilt, regret, and a full confession. He had framed Nolan. Under pressure, out of fear, promised leniency for his own crimes. But the guilt ate at him until he fled and eventually died alone, his body undiscovered, until Titan found him. Titan had done what no human ever could. He remembered. He searched. He delivered the truth. And for the first time in 13 years, Nolan had a chance to be free. The courtroom was silent, packed wall to wall with reporters, veterans, and those who had followed Nolan Briggs' story for over a decade. The energy inside buzzed with a mix of outrage and reverence, but Nolan wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking about Titan, calm beside his feet, always alert, always watching. It didn't feel real. None of it did. Just 2 weeks earlier, he was eating dry meatloaf under flickering prison lights. Now, he was standing in front of a judge again. But this time, not in shackles. No jumpsuit, no humiliation. Just a suit that didn't quite fit, and a silent prayer that this nightmare was finally ending. The judge, an older man with a sharp jaw and years of pain behind his eyes, cleared his throat and looked directly at Nolan. After reviewing the new evidence submitted by the Department of Defense, including the recovered journal, forensic confirmation of the deceased individual's identity, and the supporting testimony from military investigators, this court finds that Staff Sergeant Nolan Briggs was wrongfully convicted. A pause. Your record is hereby expunged. You are free to go, Mr. Briggs. No applause, just silence. Nolan closed his eyes, and finally exhaled. Titan stood and placed his head against Nolan's leg, sensing the change. The relief. Nolan reached down and gripped the thick fur along the dog's neck like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Because in a way, it was. Outside, the press swarmed. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved toward him. How do you feel, Sergeant? Will you sue the government? What are your plans now? He said nothing. But Titan growled low when someone got too close, and that was enough. They backed off. It was only later, once they were back in the small cabin that Nolan had been gifted temporarily by a veterans nonprofit, that the emotion finally broke through. He dropped to the floor beside the fire, still in his suit, and buried his face in Titan's fur. You brought me back, he whispered, voice cracking. You found me, when no one else would. Titan licked his face once, then rested his head on Nolan's shoulder, heavy and warm. They stayed like that for a long time. But even in freedom, Nolan couldn't shake the weight of everything he'd lost. 13 years, his military career, his family's trust, the life he had planned, friends who believed the worst and never reached out, time that could never be returned. He started getting letters, strangers from around the country. Some offered jobs. Some shared their own stories of wrongful convictions. Some just thanked him for surviving. But he didn't answer any of them. He wasn't ready. All he wanted was silence, peace, and Titan. But peace wasn't simple. One night, while walking Titan through the woods behind the cabin, they heard a branch snap. Titan froze. Another crack, then a voice. "Sergeant Briggs?" Nolan turned, heart racing. A man stepped out of the trees. Mid-40s, military stance, quiet eyes. "My name's Captain Elias Monroe. I served with Durrell years after your case." Nolan's jaw clenched. "What do you want?" "I read the reports. I read his journal. I'm sorry. I should have spoken up. I had suspicions back then, but I was a coward." Titan stood between them, unmoving. Monroe raised his hands. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to help." Nolan stared at him. "Why now?" "Because you have something bigger than revenge, Sergeant. You have truth. And there are others like you, forgotten soldiers, failed investigations, dogs like Titan left behind. We need someone who can speak for them, someone who's been through it." Nolan didn't answer. Not then, but that night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire again, Titan beside him. And a question burned inside him, like the embers glowing in front of him. Could his pain become someone else's hope? Could the dog who brought him freedom also lead him to purpose? He didn't know yet. But something told him. The journey wasn't over. Weeks passed. The snow began to melt along the trails behind the cabin, revealing the path where Titan and Nolan now walked every morning. It had become their ritual, a quiet place where Nolan could breathe again. No fences, no walls, no bars, just the rhythm of his boots and the soft pads of Titan's feet on dirt. But something inside Nolan was shifting. He had thought freedom would mean rest, that he'd finally stop running, stop remembering. But as his strength returned, so did a restless energy. He found himself waking before dawn, training again, building a routine, something he hadn't done since the military. Titan kept up, his instincts sharp despite his age, his body lean from years of survival. They were both wounded in different ways, but moving together made them feel whole again. And then came the letter. It arrived by courier. No return address, just one line on the envelope. "You're not alone." Inside was a file, a thick one. Photos, names, cases. Veterans wrongly imprisoned, military dogs abandoned after service, mishandled investigations swept under the rug. Nolan spread the documents across the cabin table, feeling his stomach turn. It wasn't just him. The system had failed others too, quietly, efficiently, and without consequence. Titan sat nearby, watching as if he understood. The next day, Nolan drove into town and met Captain Elias Monroe for coffee. "You sent the file," Nolan said without asking. Monroe nodded. "There's a pattern. And people are finally ready to listen, especially after your case went public." Nolan sipped his coffee, then looked out the window. "What are you asking me to do?" "Start something. A task force. A unit. A voice. Call it whatever you want. You've got the credibility now. People believe you. And if they believe you, they'll believe in what comes next." Nolan leaned back. "You want me to relive all that? Dig through trauma after trauma?" "I want you to give meaning to what happened to you," Monroe said softly. "To what Titan did." Nolan was silent. Later that week, back at the cabin, Nolan sat on the porch with Titan. The sun was low, painting the mountains in gold. He reached over and ran a hand down the dog's back. "You didn't survive all those years just for me to sit around doing nothing, did you?" Titan's tail thumped against the wood. That was all the answer he needed. They started small. A social media page, a mission statement, a name, K9 Truth Unit. Donations trickled in. Survivors reached out. People wanted to help, to speak, to fight back. And as the movement grew, so did Nolan. He gave interviews, spoke at veteran events, testified before oversight committees. Each time he stood before a microphone, Titan stood beside him. The media loved it. The image of the wronged soldier and the dog who saved him. But what they didn't see was how much Nolan relied on Titan just to get through each appearance. Every time the old nightmares crept in, every time the memories returned, Titan pressed against his leg and reminded him, "You're not alone." One day, after a speech at a K911 rescue conference, a woman approached, mid-50s, kind eyes. She clutched a photo of a German Shepherd with a white patch on its chest. "This was Max," she said, "my son's military partner. After my boy died overseas, they discarded Max. We never found out where he ended up." Nolan looked at the photo, heart heavy. "We're working on that now," he said. "We'll find him." She nodded, wiping a tear. "Thank you for what you're doing." That night, Nolan and Titan returned to the cabin late. He sat on the porch again, watching the stars blink overhead. "You're not done saving lives," he whispered, leaning down to hug Titan. "You never were." Titan rested his head on Nolan's lap, eyes soft. They had both been broken by a world that forgot them, but now they were building something no one could ignore. It started with a phone call from a restricted number. Nolan had just finished an early morning run through the frosted pine trail behind the cabin, Titan pacing beside him like a shadow. The sun was still low, casting long orange beams through the branches, and the air was sharp enough to sting the lungs. Nolan wiped sweat from his brow and picked up the buzzing phone without thinking. "Briggs," he answered. The voice on the other end was low, gravelly, older. "Stop digging." Nolan froze. "Excuse me?" "You think you're helping people," the voice continued, "but some things are meant to stay buried. If you care about that dog as much as they say you do, walk away." The line went dead. Nolan stood still, the phone buzzing quietly in his hand, heart pounding. He turned to Titan, who had stopped a few feet ahead, ears alert and eyes fixed back on him. They weren't just uncovering injustice anymore. They were threatening something deeper. That night, he pulled the file on the case that had triggered the most recent wave of attention. It wasn't a soldier's file this time, it was a dog's. K9 Shadow. Assigned to a covert operations unit overseas. The dog had saved lives, uncovered illegal arms caches, and was believed to have died in the field. But there were whispers, buried complaints, missing paperwork, and a classified debrief. Titan lay by the fire, watching him. As Nolan flipped through the documents, he found something odd. A photograph. It was grainy and faded, but unmistakable. A group of soldiers standing around a helicopter, and in the back, barely visible, was Titan. Nolan's breath caught. He knew every mission Titan had been on. Every detail had been logged, every handler recorded. But this photo was never part of the file. And more than that, Titan wasn't supposed to be there. He grabbed a magnifier and leaned in. Behind Titan was a man in civilian clothes. Face turned, wearing a patch that read, MI Division, Civil Assets. A unit known only in rumors. Shadow missions, no oversight. Nolan's mind raced. Was Titan involved in something he was never meant to see? The next morning, Nolan drove to Denver to meet with Captain Monroe. They sat in a quiet corner of a cafe, Titan at Nolan's feet, his presence, a comfort and a warning all at once. "I need you to tell me everything you know about the MI Division," Nolan said without preamble. Monroe's expression hardened. "That's not a path you want to go down. They used my dog." Monroe exhaled. "They've used a lot of dogs, Briggs. And a lot of soldiers. You want to open that door? You better be ready for what's on the other side. I'm not stopping. Monroe nodded slowly. Then you need to meet someone. That night, in a nondescript warehouse lit only by a single buzzing light, Nolan met a woman named Raven, former intelligence analyst. Discharged after leaking documents no one believed. Until now. She spread out photos, maps, and declassified reports. Titan appeared in more than one of them. He was part of a tracking unit used in operations that violated every rule in the book, she said. When handlers got too close to what was really happening, weapons sales, prisoner transfers, dogs were reassigned. Sometimes dogs were marked for disposal. Nolan clenched his jaw. Titan survived. He did more than survive, Raven said, sliding over another photo. He escaped. It was a grainy shot from a surveillance drone. A dog running alone across a desert road. A supply truck burning in the distance. Titan had been trying to return to Nolan long before the day he showed up at that prison gate. He remembered you, she whispered. And he remembered what they did. Nolan felt his throat tighten. They hadn't just taken his life. They'd used Titan as a pawn in something much bigger. And now they were watching. He looked down at his dog, his partner, his savior, and swore to himself that he wouldn't stop until the truth was exposed. But what he didn't know yet was that someone was already one step ahead. The snow returned. It covered the mountains in silence and slowed everything to a crawl. Everything except Nolan's heart. The files on the table in front of him glowed softly beneath a desk lamp, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Maps, memos, testimonies. It had all been compiled now, all pointing to a secret network buried beneath years of military bureaucracy. But this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. Titan lay curled near the fire, his breathing steady, but his ears twitched with every gust of wind rattling the windows. He felt it too, the pressure closing in. The threat that wasn't just distant anymore. Nolan's phone vibrated. A message. No name. They're coming. Midnight. He stood abruptly, scanning the room. Not paranoia. Preparation. They had done it once, ripped his life apart in a flash. This time, he wouldn't be caught off guard. He loaded the old handgun kept in the safe under the floorboards, checked the cameras he had installed weeks ago, and double-checked Titan's vest. The dog sat up, alert, like he understood the change in the air. We might not sleep tonight, Nolan whispered, but we've been through worse. The minutes crawled by. Midnight approached, and then headlights, 2 sets, then 3. Nolan moved to the shadows, Titan close at his side. He watched the figures step out of dark SUVs. No uniforms, no badges, just tactical gear and silence. They weren't here to talk. Nolan's voice was steady as he whispered, "Guard." Titan moved without hesitation, low to the ground, silent as death itself. The first man approached the cabin's front porch. Nolan flipped this breaker. The lights went out. He moved like muscle memory. No hesitation, no fear. He'd trained for this, long before the world labeled him guilty. The door burst open. Flashlights swept the room, but the first man through the door never stood a chance. Titan hit him like a missile, jaws clamping down on his forearm. The man screamed, his weapon clattering across the floor. Nolan emerged from the hallway, gun raised. "Drop it!" he roared to the second intruder. The man froze. Outside, more movement. Nolan fired a warning shot through the window. Tires screeched. One vehicle peeled away into the snow. Chaos. And then, silence again. Minutes later, headlights swept in from the opposite direction, red and blue this time. Sheriff Monroe. He and his deputies stormed the property, weapons drawn, until they saw Nolan and Titan standing in the wreckage, alive. It turned out Monroe had traced the message to a burner phone linked to a military contractor. The sheriff, once skeptical of Nolan's story, had been quietly monitoring calls and documents ever since Nolan gave his first public speech. This wasn't just about covering up Durrell, Monroe said, kneeling beside the downed assailant now moaning in pain. You exposed something too big. They knew you wouldn't stop. Nolan didn't speak. He was looking at Titan, blood on his coat, chest rising and falling. The old dog had risked everything again, without question. Later that night, after the medics took the injured away and deputies cleared the scene, Nolan sat with Titan on the porch steps. The sky was clear now, full of stars, but his mind churned. I don't know how many more times you've got in you, he murmured, brushing his hand over Titan's fur. You shouldn't still be doing this. You should be sleeping on some couch, chasing rabbits in your dreams. Titan exhaled slowly, then leaned into him, as if to say, I'm where I'm meant to be. And Nolan, broken but breathing, nodded. He understood now. This story was never about clearing his name. It was about giving a voice to the voiceless, the silenced soldiers, the discarded dogs, the invisible wounds that never fully heal. But to do that, he'd need to go further. He needed to bring this fight to light before Titan's time ran out. Because heroes don't always wear uniforms, sometimes they wear fur. 3 months later, the world finally listened. Nolan stood on a stage at the National Veteran Advocacy Summit in Washington, D.C. The ballroom was silent. Rows of people, senators, veterans, journalists, families, watched him. But Nolan wasn't looking at them. He was looking at Titan, lying just off stage, his head resting on his paws. The old German shepherd's breathing had grown slower. His once strong legs now trembled when he walked. Vets had said he was lucky to be alive, but Nolan knew it wasn't luck. Titan had held on with pure willpower. He was waiting for something. A moment. Maybe this one. Nolan took a breath and began. 13 years ago, I was taken away in cuffs for a crime I didn't commit. My name was dragged through the mud. My life was erased. But one soul never gave up on me, my canine partner, Titan. He paused as murmurs spread through the room. He crossed deserts. He survived the streets. And one day, he showed up at a prison gate, carrying the truth in his mouth. The screen behind him lit up with the now famous photo. Titan standing in front of Middleton Prison, holding Lieutenant Durrell's dog tag between his teeth. Gasps, then silence. Nolan continued, voice steady. Titan didn't just prove my innocence. He exposed something much deeper. Dogs like him have been used, discarded, forgotten. Soldiers too. We tell them they're heroes. Then we bury their stories when they become inconvenient. He scanned the room. Not anymore. That night, K9 Truth Unit received funding approval from 3 veteran organizations and a congressional committee. Nolan would head the task force, investigating wrongful convictions linked to classified military operations and advocating for retired K9s across the country. Titan had started a movement, but the price had been high. 2 weeks later, in the quiet warmth of the cabin, Nolan woke before sunrise. The fire had burned low. Outside, fresh snow blanketed the earth, silent and clean. Titan lay beside the hearth, unmoving. Nolan knew before he touched him. He knelt slowly, placing a hand on Titan's side. Still, peaceful, gone. The sound that came from Nolan's chest was wordless, raw grief spilling into the walls that had held so many memories. He held Titan close, burying his face in the fur that had once comforted him through the coldest nights of prison and the darkest days of doubt. He didn't speak for hours. Later that afternoon, the local sheriff helped dig the grave on the hill behind the cabin, the same hill where Titan used to sit and watch the sun go down. Nolan wrapped his partner in a military flag. Not because Titan was government property, but because he had served this country more faithfully than most men ever could. The headstone was simple: Titan Service Dog, Soldier, Savior, 2009, 2025. He never gave up. People from across the state came, fellow handlers, rescued veterans, even the woman whose son had served with K9 Max. No one spoke loudly. They didn't need to. The silence said enough. After the service, Nolan sat alone by the grave. "You waited, didn't you?" he whispered. "Until I was whole again." The wind stirred gently through the peas. "I'm going to finish this," he promised. "For you. For every dog they left behind." That spring, Nolan returned to DC with a new mission. The Titan Act, a bill to protect military canines, ensure retirement care, create public accountability for classified operations, and provide legal review for wrongfully accused service members. It gained national attention. By summer, it passed. Nolan stood on the Capitol steps as reporters flooded the area. He held up a copy of the act and smiled. But later, when the crowd had dispersed and the cameras were gone, he walked to the small memorial garden just outside the Capitol, where a bronze statue now stood. It was Titan, ears up, gaze steady, mouth slightly open, as if carrying something unseen. Nolan touched the base of the statue. "You came back for me," he said, "and now I'll make sure the world never forgets." He turned to walk away, the sun warm on his shoulders. Somewhere he felt it, the quiet rhythm of pause beside him. Not a sound, just the memory, just the bond. Unbroken. Forever. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Share it with someone who still believes in loyalty, justice, and second chances. Because sometimes the truest hero has 4 legs and never leaves your side, even after goodbye.